Hello and welcome back to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video I'll be concentrating on the poem The Cold Within by James Patrick Kinney. Kinney was an American poet born in 1923 and who died in 1974. He lived and sought for his society to be more equal, and he wrote this poem amidst the struggle of the civil rights movement. He was allegedly inspired to share this poem because of the prejudices and laws that kept his own community unequal. Now, Kinney lived in the city called Cheviot in the state of Ohio, and it was law back then that black people were not allowed on the streets of the city after dark. Now, Kinney was amongst those who was disgusted that such a law could exist and sought the city council to abolish it. The council said no black families even lived in Cheviot, so there were obviously criminals at bay if black people were found at night, so that law had to stay. Kinney and others found a black family of activists and approached them to move to Cheviot so that there could be another conversation with the city council about the law. They then went back to the city council and they said, and demanded in fact, the law had to change. Now the council did change the law, but they did that very reluctantly. So Kinney was incredibly disappointed at not just how reluctantly the council acted, but more importantly how the community responded. Originally, this poem was shared at an ecumenical church meeting. So we've got different congregations of different faiths meeting to share their ideas. And this poem had power. It was so popular that religious leaders decided to share it with their own congregations. So whilst it had power for reinvigorating this local community and maybe bringing them together, when it was sent off to the Saturday Evening Post to be published, it was initially rejected as too controversial for the time. The power of this poem that makes it so timeless is the fact it's a poetic parable. It uses the narrative poem style to tell a story. And parables are powerful because they tell us a story with more than one layer of meaning. Jesus told parables, and we can see a connection here between the faith that Kinney had and the fact that he chooses to write this poem as a parable. Let's begin with the title, The Cold Within. It's referring to people's prejudices and how that can lead to hostility that impacts their neighbour. The poem depicts a group of 6 men that are caught in a snowstorm, and we see how their prejudices and flaws lead to their death. The speaker makes it incredibly clear to us that these individuals did not die because it was physically cold, but because they failed to show compassion and, if you like, had coolness in their hearts. So failure to care has morbid consequences. This poem acts as a warning for us as readers about where our prejudices lie. The message of this poem has such power because it allows us to see that we should instead be fired up by hope and compassion, and without it, we can die to a world of intolerance, anger, and bitterness that is our own responsibility. I suspect that Kinney is also attacking American society amidst the civil rights movement, saying that the fire is dying because we cannot give more of ourselves and represent, if you like, more of Christ in our actions. Let's begin by reading the poem. 6 humans trapped by happenstance in bleak and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the story's told. Their dying fire in need of logs, the first man held his back, for on the faces around the fire he noticed one was black. The next man, looking across the way, saw one not of his church, and couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. The third one sat in tattered clothes, he gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store, and how to keep what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. The black man's face spoke revenge as the fire passed from his sight, for all he saw in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. The last man of this forlorn group did naught except for gain, giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. Their logs held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. They didn't die from the cold without, they died from the cold within. So as we read the opening stanza, we're struck by the alliterative power of Kinney's poetic voice. Humans trapped by happenstance. The conditions are bleak and bitter, and the alliterative sounds heighten the power of the haphazard nature with which these people are brought together. The weather that's bleak and bitter reflects the way each of these individuals reacts to each other. There's not much hope in what we are about to read. It's also powerful the way that verb choices seem intense and violent in the opening stanza. The humans are trapped by happenstance. Each one possessed a stick of wood. And so the verb possessed is fascinating because it suggests that each one had the tools to do something about the bleak and bitter cold. But we know, as we read, none of them uses what they possess to help them. Or so the story's told is a really great way of echoing the parable style that Kinney pays homage to in this poem. There's a bit of a mythical quality. And the poem acts as a ballad, accentuating the tragic as we unfold with each stanza, sharing a new person whose flaw stops them from doing good. Their dying fire in need of logs. So each of these 6 individuals shares the same pronoun and same human struggle. The dying fire is a metaphor for the unsustainability and futility of the hostility that is there in the group. And it's interesting that as we read this second stanza, it's expressed as a kind of anecdote for us that captures the judgment, because for on the faces round the fire, we know with this first man, he noticed one was black. The verb noticed gives us a chance to capture the judgment of this man for ourselves as we realise that there's racism there. The alliteration also of faces and fire heightens the burning issue that is racism as the focus of this stanza. The third stanza conveys the selfishness of this character. Saw not one of his church. He couldn't bring himself. The possessive nature of the pronoun his in relation to his church echoes this sense that he is not able to see beyond his own vantage point. And it's interesting, the following stanzas present the flaw of each character through the pronoun his, suggesting that what they see as theirs is never for their own good if they can't share the hope that they get from their identity. And there's almost a cinematic quality to the way that each of these stanzas pans to the next man in the group. The third stanza's concentration of the man who judges the group for having individuals that don't have exactly the same faith as him proves how religious differences can hold back the individual. And that if anything, if we're religious, we should be tolerant And therefore, the fact this man couldn't bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch is exposing his hypocrisy and lack of generosity. The fourth stanza concentrates on the third man, who's defined by the fact that he's in tattered clothes. The adjective tattered implies that he's poor. And he gives his coat a hitch, so he sits himself up in his coat. And we get a chance to understand his thought process. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? The question posed echoes the sentiment of this man and his perception of all rich people as idle, that's lazy. We know that he takes pride in the little that he has. It's his coat, it's his log. Pride in what is his is not how this situation can be made better in the conditions of bleak and bitter weather. And that's the weather of their hearts, bear in mind. Our poetic voice seems really omniscient here and probes us to see really clearly the caricatured faults that each of these men that we've met so far shows. And we're forced as readers to question this situation. What are our prejudices? Do we judge the rich as being lazy? Do we not respect equally those who have a different faith to us? Do we hold back our values with racial prejudice that holds us back? What would others see if they look closely at us? The power of this poem, as we continue to examine it, is in the way that it forces us to judge others and then judge ourselves. Now, as we dig deeper into the structural sounds and rhyme scheme of this poem, it's interesting to note that the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B in every stanza. And the rhyme scheme draws attention to us of the imperfection and awkwardness of each of the individuals we encounter. The rhyme scheme is echoing the sense of awkwardness at the imperfections and faults of each of these characters as lines 1 and 3, that's A and C of the rhyme scheme, do not rhyme, mirroring how that clash of ideas clashes in the sounds that we hear. And it mirrors the tone of this ballad as being melancholic and tragic. The structure amplifies how the faults of each of these individuals, by using third-person objective points of view, is distant. That we have a chance to take a back seat and analyse their challenging faults. But it's interesting when we move on to stanza 5, we're encountering the rich man who sat back and thought. He wants to keep quite miserly what he's earned, and he wants to keep it away from the lazy, shiftless poor. And his accusation is just as damning as the accusation we heard in the last stanza, but this time it's targeting the lazy, shiftless poor. So at this point we have to question, is Kinney mapping his poem against Christian values that state very clearly, do not judge? Because here we've met already the poor person judging the wealthy, and now we've met the rich man who's being stingy. And equally, greed or stinginess are both faults here. I think it's fascinating if Kinney is quoting Matthew chapter 7 of the Bible, because he's proving that equally being wealthy or poor has its fault if you can't help your neighbour in need. Now, interestingly, stanza 6 is directing us to the black man in the group whose face spoke revenge. His face has been personified. Now, he is a person, but the fact his face is telling us of his anger and revenge tells us that his experience of being other has made him angry, and it tells us of the hate and animosity he has for his brother around the room. The semantic field of rage across this stanza, whether it's spite, revenge, fire, echoes the tragedy of this man feeling like he can't be at peace with all these white people around him. And the internal rhyme that we get in the last line of this stanza, "Spite the white," is really sinister. It heightens the sense that they can't be at peace. Now, the penultimate stanza shows us our last character, if you like. He forms the last man of this forlorn group, and I think the adjective forlorn is very pertinent because it addresses the misery that each of their prejudices has given them. But this particular man only gives to those who give him. So there's a conditionality of his affections. And it's interesting, Kinney is very careful to use the metaphor of life as a game. He played the game. Here, this man views life as a trivial pursuit. But his vice is self-interest. And we're shown that giving only when you get is just as dangerous as being prejudiced against someone. And there we meet the final stanza, the culmination of all these faults. Their logs held tight in death's still hands. Death has been personified. Death clings on to their logs. It intensifies the victory of no one except death as they held tight. Their energies have been wasted, is what we can gather from this. It was proof of human sin. And the sin here, it would seem, is not each of their faults in turn. It's the evil because they failed to do what is right, as seen through the eyes of our poetic voice. The human sin is to withdraw compassion. The logs and the fire represent the hope. And instead, they're holding back on hope and refusing to put it into the fire and create more warmth. The poetic voice knows their cause of death. The repetition of they adds urgency that we as readers need to learn from their mistakes. They did not die from the cold without. They died from the cold within. The end of those last two lines, ending with the words, cold without, cold within. Without can mean the cold outside. Without used to traditionally mean outside. And so within is the antonym or the opposite, meaning inside. And so we know that they didn't die because of the cold weather. They died because they failed to show compassion. And as I've referenced across this poem, the symbolism of logs and wood to be functioning to provide warmth is at odds with the coldness and coolness in their hearts. The coal reflects the inability to show warmth towards others who are different. So it's fascinating. By the end of this poem, we're given closure, but it forces us to ask some desperate questions of our own actions. The cold within. The real question is, how can we manage and fail perpetually to notice that we need to care for our neighbour? The power of this poem by Kinney is timeless. It offers us a scope to step out of our comfort zone and accept that prejudices do exist, but our job as people is to step beyond that and instead do our bit to help others. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?